All right, let's dive into some legal stuff that might sound kind of boring at first, but trust me, this stuff affects us all. We're talking about service of process, procedural due process, and those choice of forum clauses you've probably seen, but maybe skipped over in contracts.
You know, what I find really interesting about these concepts is how they show how the law, even the procedural stuff, ties into our daily lives and the agreements we make.
Exactly. It's not just legal jargon, right?
Right.
It's about fairness, being able to access the justice system, and even how much say we have when we're making agreements. So let's kick things off with service of process. Sounds like something from like a king's court, but it's actually super relevant today. What does it really mean?
Okay, imagine someone telling you that to officially notify someone about a lawsuit, all you got to do is slide it under their door with their pizza menu. Doesn't exactly scream reliable or fair, does it?
Oh, absolutely not. Sounds like a recipe for disaster. Someone misses their court date because they never even knew about it.
Exactly. That's where service of process comes in. It's the official way legal documents, like a summons or a complaint, are delivered to let someone know they're part of a legal case. And here's the kicker. It's got to be done in a way that's actually likely to reach them. We're talking fairness, transparency, making sure everyone has a chance to respond if someone's taking legal action against them.
So no more hiding legal notices in like the classifieds or relying on carrier pigeons.
Well, not quite. I mean, thankfully, those methods are long gone. But the question of what's considered reasonable notice, that's something that keeps changing, especially now with the digital age and everything. One of the legal excerpts you shared really made this point clear, made me think about how courts decide what counts as reasonable these days.
Makes sense, though. The law needs to adapt, right? I mean, email wasn't really a thing back when town criers were the main way to spread news. And speaking of adapting, our sources brought up this case, Mullane v. Central Hanover Bank, which seems like it really shook things up when it comes to notice. Can you give us the lowdown?
Yeah, definitely. Mullane, that was a landmark case for sure. It really changed how courts understand what reasonable notice means. Basically, you had this bank, right? And they were trying to give notice to a bunch of people who were beneficiaries of a trust fund. This notice was about some important legal action they were taking, but get this, they were only using a newspaper publication, even though they had the actual addresses of a lot of these beneficiaries.
So they basically went with the least effective option, even when they had better ones. That seems, I don't know, kind of shady. Like they weren't really trying.
Well, the court in the Mullane case, they thought so too. This case exposed a big problem with the old way of doing things back then. They just assumed that if you owned property, you automatically knew everything that was happening with it. But the court said, no, just following some technical procedure, that's not enough. Real notice, proper notice, means you've actually got to make a real effort to tell the people involved, especially when you've got the means to do it directly.
So Mullane shifted things from just going through the motions to making sure people were actually aware. Which makes me wonder, do you think that case, Mullane, does it strike the right balance between being efficient and making sure things are fair in legal proceedings?
Oh, man, that's the million-dollar question right there. And it's something that legal experts are still debating. Mullane definitely pushed things in a direction that was more focused on fairness, no doubt. But there's always going to be this tension between being super thorough and being practical.
It's like trying to thread a needle while on a roller coaster. Right. You want to be precise, but things are always moving and shaking.
That's a great way to put it. And look, as technology changes, the way we communicate evolves, the courts are going to constantly be figuring out how to make sure notice is both meaningful and manageable. It's a work in progress.
So we've gone from shouting from the rooftops, basically, to trying to figure out reasonable notice in the digital age.
Yeah,
That's a big jump.
it is.
But it gets even trickier when we add in these choice of forum clauses, don't you think?
Yeah.
They're supposed to make legal stuff easier,
Right.
but I can see how they could cause some issues too.
Yeah, for sure. See, with choice of forum clauses, the goal is to make things more predictable. You decide up front where any legal disagreements will be heard.
Okay.
But then you run into this tricky balance between sticking to what the contract says and making sure things are actually fair.
Especially when you've got one side that has way more power than the other in the agreement.
Right.
It's like that whole David and Goliath story, but instead of a slingshot, David's stuck arguing about the fine print.
Exactly. And a perfect example of this is that Carnival Cruise Line's Ink v. Shoot case.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Remember we were talking about cruise tickets earlier?
Yeah.
Well, tucked away in all that fine print was this clause, right? It said that any lawsuits, they had to be filed in Florida, where Carnival's main office is.
Oh, wow. So if you booked a cruise from, say, California and something happened, you'd have to go all the way to Florida for the case.
Exactly.
That doesn't seem very fair.
Yeah. So in the shoot case, a passenger got injured on the cruise. They said, look, being forced to go to court in Florida just because of some clause they had no real say in,
Right.
that puts them at a huge disadvantage.
Yeah.
But the Supreme Court, they ended up siding with Carnival,
Oh, wow.
said that clause was valid.
So even if a clause seems totally one-sided, it might still hold up in court.
It might, yeah.
That's a little unnerving.
Yeah.
Did anything change after that shoot case? I mean, how do courts view these choice of forum clauses now, especially when it seems like one side has so much more power?
The shoot case definitely got people talking. It raised a lot of questions about fairness, especially in contracts where it's a regular person versus a big company. And the individual often doesn't really have a say. It showed that, yeah, having things be predictable and efficient is important.
Right.
But there needs to be some way to prevent companies from using these clauses to basically scare people away from taking them to court when they have a legitimate reason.
So it's not just about if the clause is there, but how it's being used. Like, could it actually stop someone from seeking justice? Did shoot actually lead to any changes in the law, though?
It did. The case really brought a lot of attention to how these clauses could be abused, especially in contracts with everyday consumers.
Right.
And eventually Congress passed some laws to try and put some limits on how these clauses could be used in those situations.
So lawmakers stepped in and tried to make it a bit more even. That's good. But how do they actually stop these clauses from being used unfairly, especially when they're often hidden in the fine print?
Well, they use a few different approaches. Sometimes a law might just outright ban certain types of clauses in specific contracts, like, say, those involving essential services where people don't really have many other options.
So no more sneaking in those mandatory arbitration clauses into, like, phone contracts and hoping nobody notices.
Right. Exactly. Or a law might say, these clauses have to be written in plain, clear language, easy to understand, and not buried in some footnote on page 50.
Yeah.
It's all about transparency, giving consumers a fair shot at understanding what they're getting into.
So it's got to be clear, and people got to be informed. It shouldn't be like you need a law degree just to understand a simple agreement.
Right. And some laws focus on making sure the place chosen for the case actually has some connection to what the contract's about or the people involved.
Okay, so you can't be forced to fly to, like, some island to argue about a broken coffee maker you bought online.
Exactly. It's about stopping companies from using these clauses to make it ridiculously hard or expensive for someone to actually pursue a legitimate claim.
Basically making sure you can't just buy your way out of justice.
Right.
Makes sense.
Yeah, when they're used fairly, these clauses, they can help things run smoothly in the business world.
Right.
There's a place for that. But having those safeguards in place, that's super crucial to prevent them from being used against people who don't have much bargaining power.
It's all about that balance, isn't it?
It is.
Finding that sweet spot between efficiency and making sure things are fair seems to come up a lot in legal matters, wouldn't you say?
All the time. It's this constant back and forth. And the shoot case, that really brought that tension to the forefront.
It's kind of wild how one case, like that shoot case, can have such a big impact,
Yeah.
Gets people debating, even changes the law, really shows how these legal details, even if they seem kind of technical,
Right.
they really matter in our everyday life.
They do. It makes you think, how many people are agreeing to these kinds of clauses every day and don't even realize it?
That's right, like a whole hidden world inside our contracts and agreements. Speaking of hidden worlds, we've uncovered a lot today, from like the history of service of process to all the ins and outs of these choice of forum clauses. So before we wrap up this deep dive, what's the main takeaway you hope our listeners remember about all this?
I think the biggest thing is awareness, Whether it's legal documents, contracts, or just navigating the world today, paying attention to those details about notice and where a case can be heard, it can really save you a lot of headaches down the road.
It's like that saying, knowledge is power. But in this case, it's also about protecting yourself, right?
100%. Don't just skim over the fine print and assume everything's on the up and up. If something seems off, just ask. Get some clarification.
And it's okay to push back a bit too, right? Like, just because it's written in a contract doesn't mean it's set in stone.
Absolutely. Being informed, being proactive, that's your best bet. It's how you make sure you're not caught off guard by this stuff.
So much better to be proactive than scrambling after the fact, especially with legal matters.
No doubt about it.
Well, this has been a really interesting look into this whole world of legal technicalities and contracts, that's for sure. Who knew service of process could be so important, or that those little choice of forum clauses could carry so much weight?
It just goes to show you the details matter, and sometimes the most important stuff is hidden in plain sight.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So, to our listeners, next time you're about to sign something or you get one of those official-looking envelopes in the mail, remember what we talked about today? It just might come in handy.
And hey, remember, you don't have to navigate this stuff alone. If you're ever facing a legal issue, there's help out there.
That's right.
Don't be afraid to get legal advice, to stand up for your rights.
Exactly. Knowing when to call in the experts is just as important as understanding the basics yourself. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of law and contracts. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and we'll catch you on our next deep dive into something else you probably didn't know you needed to know.